Hi, welcome. My name is Joseph Larange, and with me is Vanessa McDonald. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi.
And today the presentation is on how to construct clear logical argument maps every time with Rationale software. Part 1, because we're going to have a part 2. And the subline is a simple, universal, foolproof logical template. So if you're familiar with Rationale software, which I hope, because it'll be a little easier, I'm going to show you what it looks like here just for a moment. This is the online screen of Rationale software. And here's where you can build an argument map, which I'm assuming you're somewhat familiar with. But here you would just put in contention, and then you add reasons like this, and a reason to a reason, and then you can add co-premises. So it's that type of process that we'll be describing in detail. Well, with the Rationale software argument mapping program, there's tutorials and kind of an official model or authorized model or method of the way to use it, to create argument maps with it. And it's a great program. The problem is that the guidelines for using it have a weakness. And the purpose of this presentation is to fill that plug, to solve that problem, to correct that weakness, so that when you use Rationale argument mapping software, you'll always be able to easily, clearly create and construct a logical argument every time. Foolproof, fail-safe, guaranteed. So first we're going to talk a little bit about Rationale argument mapping software, and it is an excellent program. It uses, like many other argument mapping programs, boxes, lines, colors, and position to visually depict the structure of an argument. And then these elements, the boxes and the lines and the colors and positions, they're put together using the publisher's method based on a specific visual language or visual conventions in which there's, specific meaning attached to what the color means or what a shape means. For example, green means a reason or red means an objection. The problem is that the publisher only provides two very rough rules of thumbs, sometimes called heuristics, to help the user correctly structure the content of the premises within the boxes so that an argument is logical. Where these rules of thumb run into trouble, though, is that they're not based on an underlying clearly defined theoretical argument model. So as a result, even if these rules of thumb are followed, illogical arguments can be constructed inadvertently. So here on this slide, we're going to talk about, just as a reminder or quick introduction, about what these two rough heuristics or rules of thumbs are that the Rationale publisher provides, and then talk about more specifically how they might lead you astray. So these two rough heuristics for the structure of Rationale premises to achieve logical structural correctness are called the rabbit rule and the holding hands rule. You can read more about it in the link below, right here. the problem is that the vagueness of these two heuristics has resulted in the need for lots of argument mapping practice. And then a lot of that, the need for that, lots of argument mapping practice is discussed right here in this link. The other problem is that when students are learning to use Rationale, they struggle at different times to create a logical, structurally correct argument. And Dr. Twardy talks about that. So, did you have a comment?
Yes, looking at the first problem, you talked about lots of argument mapping practice.
That's the result of, one of the results of this vagueness.
And why is that a problem?
Well, you know, if it takes you a year to do something, or if you can learn the same thing in a week, the problem is that it's less efficient. It takes the student more time that would normally be needed to do it. So it's one of efficiency.
So by lots of argument mapping practice, you mean that it takes a student longer?
Absolutely. They've got to do a lot. You know, that's what this LAMP, which is what Dr. Ryder came up with. It kind of expresses the reality that's not often talked about, that typical argument mapping requires making a lot of maps with deliberate practice, doing the maps, getting someone to review the maps, getting appropriate corrections, so that your practice is deliberate, so that you can grow in your ability. Now, with the approach we're going to talk here in this presentation, because the heuristics are tightened up with more precision, you don't need lots of practice, because the new model, the new method we're going to talk about, guides the student so that they're less likely to make mistakes. So, just as a quick overview, the rabbit rule heuristic states that any significant term or concept which appears in the contention, that's the conclusion you're trying to prove, must also appear in one of the premises. You can find that discussed right here at this link. And below, from the tutorial, figures 6, 7, 8 are examples used to illustrate its application in the authorized rationale method tutorial. So here, of course, you have, this is the contention up on top. So this shows that the lots of stars, which will assume is a significant term, has to appear somewhere elsewhere in the argument, or the word should has to appear elsewhere. So it tries to inform the student about what has to be in each of the boxes. So this official tutorial example of the rabbit rule circles in red and blue those terms or concepts considered significant by the reviewer. But this example illustrates one of the weaknesses of that rule, because the user must first decide what's meant by the word term or concept. For example, is the word term meant to be limited to a single word? Aristotelian term is used in deductive logic. And what is a concept? It's not really made clear. It's not made clear at all. Next, the user needs to decide whether the term or concept is significant. Well, significant is a vague term. Oddly, for example, the verb to be below was not considered significant in the contention within the example below. So such vagueness within a rule of thumb is a quote, significant obstacle to a determination of logical structural correctness. The other remaining heuristic recommended by the publisher is called the holding hands rule. And it states that every significant term or concept within one premise that is not contained within the contention must have a match within another premise within the line of reasoning. And Figure 10 illustrates its application in the Rationale method tutorial, the authorized Rationale method tutorial. Figure 10 treats the term as a single word, Aristotelian term. For example, the terms are treated as Socrates as a term, or human as a term, or mortal as a term. But here the rule ignores the verbs in this example. Well, the verbs are just as important. So a limited definition of terms limits the applicability of this rule so that it would apply in every circumstance. Besides the vagueness of those concepts of concept or term or significant, the other issue is the two heuristics do not account for the difference between linked premises and supporting assumptions, which we'll describe in detail. So while the heuristics have some limited applicability for linked premises, and here you can see with the three double lines, the president and the president, or this portion in blue with this portion in blue, or this gray portion with this gray portion. So those are how they link up. Neither of the heuristics apply to a different kind of sentence in reasoning, which are called assumptions. And they're also within the green support box under the typical publisher conventions. So the user needs to know how to distinguish between linked premises and supporting assumptions that these heuristics, so that they're not misapplied. But the typical instructions about how to use Rationale don't make clear how to distinguish between that. So that's what together creates the problem with these heuristics. So while they're a step in the right direction to guide students, they don't go far enough in defining the premise structure, and that's the sentence within the boxes within Rationale. They still permit creating faulty argument. More precise and rigorous scaffolding of the premise content solves the Rationale method structural vagueness. So with the application of the logic bridge, which is the name of the new method for using Rationale that we'll be explaining today, the scaffolding or the guidelines within the logic bridge removes this vagueness. And in that way, Rationale can be transformed into a precise and rigorous tool that always produces a clear and logical argument, regardless of the type of inference or subject matter domain. So here's what I ask. Just for a little while, please set aside for the moment any familiarity that you have with the Rationale software and actually logic in general, and just bring your beginner's mind. So you will, just a note here, even the typical visual language or conventions of Rationale are adjusted to be more effective. If you want to learn, a more in-depth academic discussion about the logic bridge, which we'll be describing here as it's applied with the Rationale software, here's two links that you can go for two peer-reviewed Oxford Journal articles that explain it in more detail. So first we're going to start with just some basic terminology so that some of the terms we use as they apply to the logic bridge method will be clear to you. And I know just giving a definition doesn't make everything clear from the start, but as we go through the presentations, we'll keep giving examples of each of these terms so that they become clear. And of course, because this is on video, you can go back as many times as you need to review the material. So there's actually very few words or terms that need to be mentioned first when beginning to discuss guaranteed practical logical reasoning with Rationale software. So what do we have? How many? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 terms. The first one is the contention. A contention is the statement that you want the audience to accept as true. Sometimes it's called a claim, conclusion, or thesis. It's the perspective of reality that you want to prove to an audience as a fact. For example, one contention might be, Henry is a British subject. Now this particular example is from the seminal work by Toulmin in his Uses of Argument book that he wrote first in 1958. And many people in argument are familiar with this, and we'll compare the logic bridge to the Toulmin model later. But this is kind of the classic example that's often used in describing arguments. So here's our contention. Henry is a British subject. A reason. Well, a reason is the structure, sometimes called an inferential network, of the connected sentences. And those are linked premises and supporting assumptions, and we'll make that distinction more clear later, that is intended to persuade the audience to accept that the contention is true with some degree of certainty or probability. For example, consider the following 2 linked premises. So here we have 2 premises. Henry was born in Bermuda, and anyone born in Bermuda is a British subject. And of course, together, these comprise the reason to support this contention. Our next term is a premise. A premise is a sentence that, when joined back to front, and I'll explain that one in great detail, to other sentences, form a transitive line of reasoning for the contention. And this whole topic of premises, which we'll be starting out first in our more detailed explanation, we'll go through that very slowly and carefully with a lot of examples. So what this definition implies is made clear. The next one is an assumption. And an assumption is a sentence that provides support. And there's actually 2 kinds of support that can be provided. Necessary, you must have it, or ancillary, which is it's helpful, but if you didn't have it, it's not critical to a premise. It describes a state of affairs that can increase the probability of the truth of the premise. And our last term, just to get us started, is argument. An argument is the combination of the contention, which is what you're trying to prove, and the reason, which are the premises and assumptions that lead your audience to hopefully accept the truth of your contention. Any questions so far?
No questions.
Okay. Here we go. So you've left behind all your thoughts about logic, remember? So we're going to think about logical reasoning, perhaps differently than you have in the past. So we're going to start with an argument structure metaphor. So we're going to use an embodied metaphor, a way of thinking about argument that can help you reason more effectively. So the degree to which the audience accepts your contention, remember that's the conclusion, claim, or thesis, as true or as a fact. And remember we said degree, so it could be it's probably true, possibly true, it's probably true, it's certain, largely depends on the audience's opinion of the strength or the goodness, quality, or probative weight of the reasoning that leads to the contention. And that reasoning strength, like the strength of a bridge, depends largely largely on two primary characteristics. The first characteristic, it depends on the degree to which the sentences, the premises that comprise the line of reasoning, are subjectively perceived to be a true or a fact. So I said subjectively, so a different audience or a different person could look at the same sentence and make their own individual personal decision about how much they believe that to be true or not. That's why you can have jurors who disagree on the facts in a case. Everybody can perceive claims, contentions differently. And the other characteristic, remember we said there are two primary ones in determining, the strength of a bridge or an argument, is whether the audience perceives the structure, the form or the pattern of the argument to be logical. And that's called structurally correct. Imagine you have a bridge made without following, the appropriate principles of that structure to hold together. People aren't going to walk on it. The argument's not going to hold. The bridge isn't going to hold. So if you want the audience to have confidence in your logical reasoning, they've got to be able to see the structure of it. And admittedly, it's often intuitive, but intuitively sense that it's structurally correct, that it makes sense. Well, to be sure, to guarantee that an argument is logical, the meaning of the sentences, the premises and the assumptions that together form the line of reasoning, and that the contention being asserted, must be capable of being expressed or regimented into words that can combine together into a standardized, defined structure, form, or pattern. This can be a deductive form, inductive form, adductive, argument scheme. Now, you don't have to know what these mean, because with the logic bridge, this is, a generalizable, universal pattern of reasoning that can accommodate any kind of pattern. Any other pattern is subsumed or contained within the logic bridge. And just like for any bridge that holds together, there's different strictly defined, structurally correct designs required for arguments to hold together, to be logical. Here you have different kinds of designs for bridges, and the same is true for arguments. You can have deductive structures or inductive or abductive, and others we're not even discussing here. But to learn all those different designs takes a lot of work, a lot of time. You're never sure if your audience is going to be familiar with that. But the logic bridge, you only have to learn one. And because it relies on, as we'll discuss, types of cognitive abilities that we generally acquire by age of 5, the reasoning's obvious to anybody who's older. So just as the necessary structurally correct design of a sound bridge may not always be readily apparent to the observer, the underlying logical structure of a good line of reasoning may not always be readily apparent in the arrangement of its sentences as words first presented. Here you can look at this beautiful bridge in China, infinity loop bridge, and on its surface, how it holds together, the kind of bridge, the underlying bones of it, isn't really apparent. But that doesn't really make a difference, because it was built based on a clearly defined, accepted pattern. But unlike a bridge, it's essential that the logical structure of the argument be made self-evident to the audience for them to be persuaded, because they're not going to follow you out onto that argument and accept it without knowing that it's going to hold together. And to know that it's going to hold together, the logical structure of the argument has to be clear. So now we're going to get into the details on the logic bridge design, which is the name of the approach that we'll be discussing here to use with the rational argument mapping software, so that the use of the rational argument mapping software guaranteed always produces a clear logical argument. It's foolproof. You can't put in illogical argument within the scaffolding or the template of the logic bridge, because it won't fit. So as I described here, there is an all-purpose argument structure called the logic bridge. Now, there is a formal name for this. You can just forget it, but I'll mention it once here, which is the formal name of this universal logical form is Defeasible Class Inclusion Transitivity. That's a mouthful. Or DKIT. So now you've seen it, now you can forget it. Just think of it as the logic bridge. Any type of logical argument, deductive, inductive, abductive, or other argument schemes such as promulgated by Pollock or Walton, can fit within this identical logic bridge argument structure. Metaphorically, it resembles a cantilever-style bridge. So we're trying to get you to think about argument metaphorically as you might think about a bridge, to give you a sense of, familiarity about how the argument's going to be structured and what the components of the argument mean, because you're familiar with the components of a bridge. So metaphorically, it resembles a cantilever-style bridge, which of course I never heard of before until I started looking at bridges and trying to see if there was a design that was similar to the logic bridge, and there actually was. So each horizontal span, and here's a cantilever bridge, here's one span, two spans. Each horizontal span represents each of the two or more premises that link together to form the logical line of reasoning that leads to the conclusion. So a span is the same as a premise. Here's premise 2, or the other span in this cantilever, and that's how it would look in Rationale software as the second premise for your reasoning. And these vertical piers here that help provide support to the premises beneath each span, they represent the supporting assumptions for each linked premise in the line of reasoning. So each premise, and we'll when we get into examples, this will be clear. Each premise can have one or more assumptions that support it. The existence of that, the truth of that premise. Well, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how the logic bridge works. But this part I'm going to discuss here, you don't really have to know. You just have to fill in the blanks with the logic bridge, which is what it's about it. You don't have to learn a lot of fancy terms. But for those of you that have a curiosity about it, we're just going to give a quick overview of the nature, the inferential nature of the logic bridge. And the logic bridge relies on two inferential abilities for its reasoning power. And those two are transitive inference, number 2, class inclusion. And what's amazing is, children acquire various reasoning skills over remarkably similar periods of development. Transitive inference and class inclusion are two behaviors among a suite of inferential abilities that have strikingly similar developmental profiles. All are acquired around the age of 5 years for most typical kids. So, the logic bridge uses cognitive abilities that a 5-year-old has. And that's a great benefit. Not that you're worried about making logical arguments to 5-year-olds, but when you're making them to people who are older, the chance of them following your line of reasoning is greatly enhanced. The first one is class inclusion. You might think of it as categorization. For example, older children also understand that a grocery store will contain more fruit than apples. That is, the number of items belonging to the superclass is greater than the number of items in any one of its subclasses. This form of reasoning is called class inclusion, or categorization. So we know that apples, belong to or are a member of the category fruit. So this idea of class inclusion or membership is one of the key inferential abilities that supports the functioning of the logic bridge. Remember, you don't have to remember this part about these cognitive details. The second inferential ability is transitivity. Okay, seems pretty complex here at the start, but it's not that bad. It says a transitive inference has the general form that gives A are B and B are C, meaning A has a relationship to B, B has a relationship to C of the same relationship. Then one can infer A has that relationship to C, where R is some binary relation that has the transitivity property. Pretty confusing, right? Well, the example hopefully makes it a little clearer. For example, taller might be that capital R of that relationship. So older children can infer that if John is taller than Mary, and Mary is taller than Sue, then John is taller than Sue. This form of reasoning is called transitive inference. And this works because the relationship taller is transitive. Not every relationship is transitive, but for the logic bridge model, logic bridge relies on class inclusion or membership, and membership is transitive. And that's where the power of the logic bridge comes from. Okay, this last term, remember we're kind of talking through each of the name of the defeasible class inclusion transitivity, which is the academic name for the logic bridge. And the last one is defeasible. So claims can usually be challenged or opposed in two ways. First, by a denial of the facts upon which they are based, and secondly, by something quite different, namely a plea that although all the circumstances on which the claim could succeed are present, yet in the particular case, the claim should not succeed because other circumstances are present which brings the case under some recognized head of exception, the effect of which is either to defeat the claim altogether or reduce it. So, judging from this quotation, it would appear that Hart had the idea of a claim being at first acceptable because it's supported by reasoning, but that is later defeated because circumstances are present that bring the case under an exception. Thus we recognize the idea of a defeasible argument of a kind so common in law. So defeasibility is about recognizing that when you have an argument, it might hold true for now, but if new facts come in to evidence, that argument may no longer hold. So it's not absolute true for all time, like you might find in certain reasoning in formal logic. The idea of defeasibility makes it, reasoning more practical, since it resembles the everyday kind of arguments that we deal with all the time or in court. This is a kind of a graphic to explain those two principles. I know it looks like Venn diagrams, but it isn't. But here you have, for example, two premises. The president has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate. That's premise one. Premise two is one who has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate was born in Hawaii. So the conclusion is, and this is through transitivity, the president was born in Hawaii. Another way of saying it is, okay, well, the president, that's A, and so this inside that green rectangle represents that category, fits within that category, has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate. So you notice it's the whole predicate of that sentence, which we'll talk about later, including the verb. And anything that has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate, which is everything which inside this category, is alleged was born in Hawaii, meaning you're claiming that it fits within this category. So then transitivity says that if A belongs or fits within B, and B belongs to the category C, then you can see just visually that A belongs or is a member of C. And that's the class inclusion transitivity feature. But these are not, for those of you who know something about deduction, these are not Aristotelian terms. Those are just single words. That's one of the big differences between this new syllogistic way of reasoning and something like deduction or Aristotelian, where the terms are single words. For those of you that know nothing about that, don't worry about it. You don't need to know it. So there's 4 design requirements for the logic bridge structure. I know as I describe these, don't worry. It's much easier than it sounds at first glance, really, once we do the examples. But this is a page or a slide you can come back to over and over, as a review. But 4 things must be in play for this logic structure to work, so that any argument you produce will be logical. The first is the premise structure. And that is such that each individual sentence of the argument is regimented or, structured into a categorical form. So you're turning the sentence into categorical form, which we'll describe, which consists of a subject phrase and a predicate phrase. And we'll spend a lot of time on that in this presentation. But what you're doing is, if you have a sentence and it's not in this subject predicate form, you have to move the wording around until in any sentence, it's been found can be put into a categorical form. Number 2, the second requirement, the design requirement for building your logic bridge argument structure, is it has a clear start and finish. So a line of reasoning, or just like on a bridge, when you start going over the bridge, is one end cap to the bridge, and the other end cap is the finish when you're traveling across it. And you have a start and finish with the logic bridge too. And the way it's achieved, and we'll obviously make it clear with examples, is the subject phrase of the first linked premise must be the subject phrase of the main conclusion, and the predicate phrase of the last linked premise in the line of reasoning must be the predicate phrase of the main conclusion. And I'm sure that's all very confusing until we get to the examples. But this is a sheet you can come back to for review. The third one is the transitive linkage. And what that means is that the remaining predicate phrases of each linked premise must be the subject phrase of the following linked premise prefaced by a universal quantifier, such as one or any, all, basically like the subject, and then who or that, creating a transitively linked chain of premises back to front in that distinct order. The last one is assumption support. So for each linked premise, any associated supporting assumptions that provide some degree of support, remember it can be necessary or ancillary, to the truth of the linked premises are appropriately added. So we're going to go through in detail what each of these requirements, what they look like, how to do them, how they work in building a clear logical argument. They're actually fairly easy once you see them in action. So we're going to begin with the first of the four requirements of the logic bridge design requirements. And number one is the premise structure. So each sentence, whether it's a premise or an assumption, remember there's two kinds of sentences used in the logic bridge. Each sentence of the logic bridge line of reasoning is structured or regimented into a categorical sentence consisting of three parts. So I'm taking you back now to third grade elementary school, which for some of us may have been a long time ago. So the subject phrase, if it's more than one word, the subject phrase, you have the subject phrase of a sentence. You have remember these are categorical sentences. You have a predicate phrase of the same sentence. And there's the nexus that joins them. And that's the unseen, intangible space where the subject and the predicate of the sentence meet together. So while, when you're constructing arguments, it sometimes takes a little extra work to put the sentences in a categorical form. Any sentence can be rearranged. The words can be arranged so the meaning's the same, but it can be structured or regimented into this categorical form. Here you see, for example, in the sentence, the president is a natural-born U.S. citizen. The subject is the president. The predicate phrase here is the following: is a natural-born U.S. citizen. And the nexus is kind of the space between those two in the sentence. This may take you way back, but this is, remember from Schoolhouse Rock, which was the show on TV that some of you may have seen. This was the tale of Mr. Morton, which they sing along to kind of teach these concepts. And in the song, as a reminder for some of you, it says, the subject is a noun. Here it's a noun phrase. That's a person, place, or thing. It's who or what the sentence is about. I'm not going to sing the song, I forgot the melody. And the predicate is the verb, and it could be the verb phrase, the things after it. That's the action word, or words. That gets the subject up and out. And like we said before, here in this sentence, this is the subject of the sentence, and this is the predicate. So here I've done some examples of parsing or, separating sentences into the subject phrase and the predicate phrase. So here you see the original sentence. For example, the president is a natural-born U.S. citizen, and I've divided them into their subject and predicate parts. Here's the newspaper published a false birth announcement. You can see over here I've divided into two parts. Now, of course, for this presentation, I'm we'll be using sentences that have looked this way, where I've actually, with indicators like these dashes to show you the two parts. But in practice, of course, you can just treat the sentences once they're categorical. You don't have to break them and make that more obvious, which I'll be doing here. Here we have the sentence, the governor had personal knowledge of the birth, and we've broken it into the subject phrase and the predicate phrase. Here we have the sentence, the birth certificate was authentic, and we've separated it into the subject phrase and the predicate phrase. And our last example here is the constitutional requirement was fulfilled. And here we've broken them into two. You'll notice the predicate phrase always starting with the verb. Remember nouns and verbs? Now this nexus, which is, almost mysterious quality, is the nexus between the subject and the predicate of the sentence, represents the categorical or membership relationship between the two parts of a sentence. So here, for example, up above, right here, the smaller green rectangle belongs within, or is a member of, the larger yellow rectangle category. So the sentence here, the president is a natural-born U.S. citizen, this nexus in a sense is saying, by turning these subject phrase and predicate phrase and putting them into a single sentence, in effect what you're saying is that the category the president is a member of, this category here, is a member of the next category, which is the predicate phrase. It belongs to this, which is a natural-born U.S. citizen. Now, if you didn't think it belonged into this category, that's when you would say, no, I don't think the president is a natural-born citizen, because I don't think the category, the president, belongs within this category.
So are you saying that the subject phrase is always contained within the predicate phrase?
I'm saying when you make a, yes, that's another way of putting it. When you make a sentence, that's what the sentence means, is that the subject phrase, it's an assertion. A sentence is an assertion, a categorical sentence. So you're asserting that the president, the subject phrase, belongs or is a member of the predicate category. Now that sentence may not be true, but the sentence does represent that assertion. That's the assertion you're making. Okay. Here's our second design requirement for the logic bridge. And this is a start and a finish. So there actually is a start and finish for any line of reasoning with the logic bridge, which becomes very helpful for a number of reasons, which we'll discuss later. So the logic bridge requires that the subject of the first premise and the predicate of the last premise in the line of reasoning form the contention or claim or thesis. So this pattern creates the start and finish for the line of reasoning. So any additional premises that come along, if needed, must fit between these end caps. So let's look down here. Here we have the conclusion or the contention that the president was born in Hawaii. So here we have an argument which is made up of the contention and the reason, and the reason consists of these two linked premises. The first linked premise is the president has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate. And the second link premise is one who has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate was born in Hawaii. Misspelling there. And so I can conclude through transitivity that the president was born in Hawaii. So you can see that there's that the subject of the conclusion or contention is the same as the subject of the first premise. And the predicate phrase of the conclusion or contention is the predicate of the last premise in the line of reasoning. So I could have 10 premises across here, and the last premise would always have the predicate of the conclusion, and the first premise would always have the subject of the conclusion. Now we're moving on to the third of the four requirements in how you structure for the logic bridge. And this is about that transitive linkage. So the premises of the logic bridge line of reasoning are arranged in a specific order by linking each other back to front, creating a transitive relationship. So what does this back to front mean? Well, the linkages are created by the predicate of one premise matching the subject of the next premise down the line of reasoning with the addition of a universal quantifier in front of the subject, which could be one who, or any who, or all who, or one that, or any that, or all that. So here you can see, here we have the conclusion or the contention that the president, which is the subject, and the predicate phrase was born in Hawaii. And so now we're talking about how do we link each premise to the next. There could be more here. How do they each link? And what you do is the predicate phrase of one premise must become the part of the subject phrase of the next premise. So these are identical, this red and this blue. And the quantifier, actually this orange should be in front of the who as well, right here, is added in front, this universal quantifier. So they're called linked premises because the back or the predicate phrase of one premise becomes the front end of the next premise. So the ordering of the premises is important because you have to have this linkage, and then you add the one who or one that in front of it, and then that, just like railroad cars, how they connect, that's how they're linked. And the last requirement is to recognize assumption support. So an assumption, and here you can see it down in the red box here. You'll note, by the way, that when we're using Rationale, normally red boxes are, the visual convention is that it means an objection. For the use of the logic bridge, the convention is that it means an assumption. So here, an assumption provides necessary, not necessarily sufficient, but necessary. It can provide either necessary or ancillary support to the premise it supports. So you can see it's like in a bridge, it's underneath. So it supports the linked premise above it. And so an assumption describes a state of affairs alleged as fact that supports the truth of the premise, the linked premise that's above it. So the subjective level of certainty of the truth of a premise, how much somebody believes, for example, this is true. Well, it's probably true, or possibly true, or absolutely true. That subjective level of certainty can be impacted by the level of certainty of the assumption that supports it. So here, the assumption below is this is necessary for premise 2 to be true. So you could have the premise, one who was born in Hawaii is a natural born citizen. But that's only going to be true if the person was born when Hawaii was a state or a U.S. territory. So if I can show, this is actually a necessary assumption. So if I can show, they were born in, I'll make up a date, 1800. I'm not sure when it was a U.S. territory. The truth of this premise 2 would be refuted. So that's how assumptions work. It's like another fact, in a sense, that would have to be true to help for this to be true, and that's true for necessary assumptions. Notice it's not about the inference linking, the connection between the linked premises. This assumption only applies to the premise that's above it. Also, the assumption below provides ancillary or helpful support for premise true to be true. So remember, assumptions can either be necessary or ancillary. So from the information provided by this assumption, here, the person was born in 1961, the audience knows that at least the objection regarding the timing of statehood of Hawaii is not an issue. So in this manner, assumptions can be regarded as anticipatory responses to possible objections. So, if I can prove this assumption that they were born in 1961, pardon me, I'm strengthening, the level of certainty of the premise above it, because I know that the exception that they might have been born at a time when it wasn't a state or U.S. territory is off the table. So this is how ancillary support is provided. Now here we're going to look at a Supreme Court case, Illinois versus Wardlow, as an example where they illustrate two ancillary assumptions. So this was stated in the dissent. Among some citizens, particularly minorities and those residing in high crime areas, there's also the possibility that the fleeing person is entirely innocent, but with or without justification, believes that contact with the police can itself be dangerous apart from any criminal activity associated with the officer's presence. So given that idea that was in that Supreme Court decision, here we have a contention or conclusion. The defendant was plausibly unlawfully arrested by the police fleeing the scene. So that's a claim you're trying to make, or a contention. And here we have three linked premises. The first one is the defendant fled from the crime scene. The second one is one who fled from the crime scene was plausibly just fleeing for fear of police abuse. And the third premise is one who was plausibly just fleeing for fear of police abuse was plausibly unlawfully arrested by the police fleeing the crime scene. So here, thinking about this dissent, Well, what assumption might be helpful for this premise 2 to be considered true? Remember, premise 2 is one who fled from the crime scene was plausibly just fleeing for fear of police abuse. Well, one assumption is the defendant was a member of a minority class who fled in a neighborhood that was known for police abuse to minorities. So if this was true, it could help lend some credence to the truth of this premise right here. Another assumption that might help support the truth of this statement is that the defendant had been unjustly abused by the police in the past. So that would lend some support that a person who fled from a crime scene, was just fleeing for fear of police abuse. So this kind of demonstrates how you structure out assumptions separate from the inferentially linked premises, and that they're two different types of sentences within an argument. This part I'm not going to read. You can come back and look at it later, but this is about how Wardlow illustrates that the choice and degree of acceptability of premises and assumptions can be dependent on the worldview of the audience. So when you're making an argument, all these subsequent premises after the first one, all are a type of generalization because they all begin with the words one who or all who or whatever. And if those generalizations are considered true, depends, on different issues. Who is it? A stereotypic generalization? There's problems with these. So, just like Twining points out, the use of generalizing in logical reasoning, which you can't avoid, is necessary, but it's dangerous. The other problem is that the choice of the appropriate generalization, or premise 2 on, is also dangerous when the chooser lacks sufficient imagination to consider all the possible generalizations that might apply, since the most appropriate one may be missed. This is something you can come back and look at your leisure. And our last requirement is about assumption sets. I'm sorry. This is number 4, which is still about assumptions. But this points out that assumptions can also come in groups or sets, depending on the reasoning involved. So here you see that assumptions can also come in sets that can accompany certain types of reasoning or inference steps, such as ones that depend on the reliability of a source, or upon analogy, or upon sample generalizing. So below, this is an example of 4 typical assumptions that accompany the circumstance when the reliability of a source concerns an expert. So here we have the contention. The president actually has an authentic birth certificate. That's what we're trying to prove. You can see we have 2 linked premises. Premise 1, the president has an authentic birth certificate according to an expert. Premise 2, one who has an authentic birth certificate according to an expert actually has an authentic birth certificate. So that supports this contention that the president actually has an authentic birth certificate. This happens through the process of class inclusion transitivity. Well, as you can see, this statement here, the truth of that relies on the reliability of a source, and the source here is an expert. And when you're relying on an expert, typically there can be more, but there's at least these 4 assumptions that will always accompany this kind of statement when an expert's involved and you're relying on the expert. this assumption is that the expert has sufficient qualifications and stature. The next one is that the expert relied upon a theory or technique that has general acceptance in the scientific field of study. The next assumption supporting this premise too is the expert made proper use of the theory or technique. And the last one is the error rate of the technique is acceptable. Here, below is an example of 4 typical assumptions that accompany the circumstance when the reliability of a source concerns a witness. So here we have the contention the president was actually born in Hawaii. And premise 1 is the president was born in Hawaii according to a witness. Premise 2 is one who was born in Hawaii according to a witness was actually born in Hawaii. So by class inclusion transitivity, the president was actually born in Hawaii. Well, you can see in this premise too that the truth of this depends on the reliability of the source who's a witness. And there's at least 4, and certainly more, assumptions that accompany this type of premise about witness reliability. The first one is that the witness was in a position to know, that they have personal knowledge. The second assumption is the witness has sufficient memory and perceptual capacities. The third one is the witness gave sufficient attention to the event. Another one is the witness was sufficiently certain. So this is again illustrating how there can be sets of assumptions that typically accompany certain types of premises. And these are premises involving here the reliability of a witness. Here we have, below is an example of 4 typical assumptions that accompany the circumstance when the reliability of a source concerns a measuring instrument. So here we have the contention the birth certificate ink was actually authentic. And our 2 linked premises are, here's the logic bridge, the birth certificate ink was authentic according to the instrument. Premise 2, one that was authentic according to the instrument, was actually authentic. So here we have a premise that deals with the reliability of a source, and here that source is an instrument. Here's 4 assumptions that typically accompany that type of premise and that you would want to consider when you're constructing this line of reasoning. One is that the instrument was properly calibrated. Certainly have a problem if it wasn't. Here the instrument was administered and read correctly. Here the instrument readings were recorded accurately. And here the instrument readings were not altered. Now we move on. Here, this is an example of 5 typical assumptions that accompany an analogy reasoning line. And I'm not going to read these again here. You can read them at your leisure. But the point is that when you have a premise like this that relies on the use of analogy, these are 5 typical assumptions that typically accompany that. And the last one we're going to discuss quickly, this is about sample generalizing. And here we have the contention, the sample of citizens polled sufficiently proves by generalizing induction that actually the voting public generally believes the president's citizenship claim. And this premise that you can look at later, the truth of that relies on the principle of generalizing by a sample. Well, if you're going to be considering the truth of a premise like that in assessing the strength of this line of reasoning, you're going to have to look at at least these 5 assumptions. That typically accompany reasoning by generalizing. For example, this one. There are enough facts to support the inference that all unknown relevant facts will support the same conclusion. So this is about adequate sample size. So this is just to illustrate again that you can have sets of assumptions that generally group together and apply to certain types of premises. Some of them are when you have a reliability of a source, some of them are analogy, some of them are sample generalizing, and there can be other circumstances as well. Okay, so now we're going to move on to evaluating argument strength. So once the 4 required elements of the logic bridge design protocol are followed, you can be sure that the argument is clear and logical. And any argument that's logical can be fit into that pattern. And if it can't be fit into that pattern, assuming you're doing it right, then the argument is not logical. So the logic bridge pattern actually filters out illogical arguments. So the next step is the evaluation of the strength of the argument. And the strength of a correctly structured logical argument largely depends on the audience's. Remember, we've already created a correctly structured logical argument. So that part of argument strength has been covered. So once you have that, the strength largely depends on the audience's subjective perception of the degree of acceptability, probability, or believability of the individual linked premises, which is impacted by the strength of the assumptions. So if you have an argument and it's logically constructed, the strength of that argument, which is a subjective determination, will depend on the audience's perception of how true each of the premises are. So remember also that any argument structure can be analogized to a cantilever bridge with those horizontal spans and vertical piers. And the strength of the bridge depends on the strength of the spans and the strength of the piers. And the same applies to the logic bridge, which is when I'm trying to determine how certain I am about this premise, for example, 1, that determination has to be made while also considering any assumptions that support it. So when I'm determining how believable a linked premise is, I have to consider how believable is any assumption underneath it. And of course, if it's a necessary assumption and you conclude that it's false, then any premise that this assumption supports will also be false. Okay, I know you've seen this truck floating around. What the heck is that about? So we finally get to discuss the metaphorical certainty truck that drives over the logic bridge. Right here. Remember, we got to start and we've got to finish as it goes over the 2 or more premises. So it's driven by the audience, who starts out with 10 boxes, just you can imagine that, filled with his or her total supply of certainty or belief for any line of reasoning. So the amount is always 100% at the start. Here we've got 10 boxes. You can think of it, each one is 10%. So when you approach, an unbiased person, reasonable person who's considering a line of reasoning as they start traveling that line of reasoning, they start with if they have an open mind, they start with 100% certainty. Now they may lose some of that certainty as they travel across the bridge, but at least they start out that way. So how much of his or her certainty is left at the finish after this truck gets all the way to the end of the logic bridge depends on how strong the audience perceives the strength of each linked premise. If a premise isn't subjectively perceived strong enough to hold 100% of the uncertainty, meaning the audience is not certain that the premise is a fact, then the audience must leave forever some of his or her certainty behind and continue on over the logic bridge without it, which we'll illustrate hopefully in the next slide here. No, it's coming up, not the next one. You'll see that soon. So here's the example that kind of explains how you leave those boxes behind. For example, the audience might decide how strong, here you can use 0 to 100%, is the nexus between the subject, the president, and the predicate has a Hawaiian birth certificate. So we're looking at premise 1, which I've blown up right here. And the audience is trying to assess, well, how strong do I think this connection is between the president and has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate? Stated another way, how believable is this sentence? Or how certain am I that the president belongs to the category, has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate? So you kind of have a question here about whether this category belongs to this category. Because this, remember, a sentence is an assertion that it fully belongs. 100%. So stated another way, to what degree does the audience believe premise 1 is true or certain? It could be not at all, 0%, absolutely 100%, possibly maybe less than 50%, probably more than 50%. There's a lot of textual terms that can, that are used to describe the degree of belief. So here we can say hypothetically, just for an example, the audience might subjectively perceive that premise 1 has a 50% probability of being true. You can see it right here. We put in the 50%. So this indicates that the audience, and remember, you have a different audience, this number could change because it's a subjective determination, that this one is 50% probability. But premise 2, they think 100% probability. And we're not going to deal right now with the impact that the assumptions might have on these numbers. So we're just worried about premise 1 and premise 2, and we're evaluating the strength of this argument. Remember, the argument is the contention and the reasoning, which includes the linked premises and the supporting assumptions. And because it's been structured in the logic bridge format, we know it's logical, but that's not the final step in determining its strength. Once we know it's logical, which is a yes or no determination, now we're considering the strength of these spans or these premises. And here, by way of example, we're just going to assume that the audience thinks 50% for the first premise and 100% true, absolutely certain for premise 2. So here's what happens. As the audience travels over premise 1, it must leave behind half of his or her certainty or belief because he or she subjectively perceives that the strength of premise 1 can only handle 50% of his or her load or weight of certainty, the probative weight. So half of the boxes have been removed. So you can see it starts out, this is how to think about it with an embodied metaphor. You start out the line of reasoning, the audience considers it, but because they perceive that the truth of this first premise is only 50%, they have to dump half the load of this certainty, 5 of the boxes. So before they get to this 100% solid, absolutely solid premise, the truck only has half the certainty remaining before it even starts over there. So what happens is that a contention reached from start to finish or justified from one line of reasoning, and we're putting aside the issue of objections right now, possesses only the smallest subjective level of certainty of truth, here 50%, that can be supported by any one of its premises. So in this example, even though the audience subjectively perceives the strength of premise 2 at 100%, the level of certainty for the contention is only 50% based on the weakest premise of the logic bridge, which is basically saying, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. And that's what you hear. The bridge is only as strong as its weakest span, or the logic bridge is only as strong at most as its weakest premise. So here you have a premise considered to be only 50%. That means that the audience has already lost half their certainty here. So it maintains that half a certainty as it goes over premise true, because that's at 100%. But the contention is based on the certainty of that's left when the audience reaches the finish line. But remember, the determination of the strength of any premise is subjective. So a different audience, just like a different juror, might, as illustrated below, reach a totally different conclusion of the strength of the argument. Here, the audience, remember it's a different audience. I could have made the truck a different color, I guess. Here the audience perceives each of the two premises as 100%, absolutely certain. So the contention is evaluated at 100% certain, because the weakest link, the weakest span, is 100%. So the contention can be considered 100%. Now these are kind of just, heuristics to think about how weighing the strength of an argument happens. It actually can be more complex than this, but this is a good way to begin to think about it. Okay. Great topic here. Qualifiers. Those of you that know the Toulmin model of argument, is certainly familiar with qualifiers. But let's show you how it works with the logic bridge when you're using the Rationale argument mapping software. So this example illustrates using qualifiers to possibly increase the perceived level of certainty of a contention by adding qualifiers where appropriate. Of course, the addition of a qualifier to a contention does change the level of uncertainty explicitly expressed for that contention. So qualifiers are words like some or many or most, probably, likely, possibly, generally. So here we're going to look at one contention without the addition of one argument, in fact, without the addition of qualifiers. And then we're going to add qualifiers and see what kind of changes that makes. So here we have a contention. The president was born in Hawaii and is supported by two linked premises. The president has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate, and one who has a valid Hawaiian birth certificate was born in Hawaii. I put the assumptions in here, but we're not going to talk about them for this example. So we can see that this particular audience who's driving this truck perceives the first premise as 100% certain, and subjectively perceives the second premise as only 40% certain. So by the time this truck gets to finish, it's only got 4 boxes left for the 40%. So this is our weakest span in the bridge. So, for simplicity's sake, we're going to say that the contention is only 40%. Now, what happens when you add a qualifier? Well, here, we've added a qualifier to this premise 2, which is one who has a Hawaiian birth certificate was likely born in Hawaii. So, if I wanted to up that 40%, I have to recognize that if I add a qualifier, I might increase the level of certainty for that premise, which is, in this example, actually what happened here. So if I change this, if I add a qualifier, the audience then might perceive greater strength to that particular premise. Here, hypothetically, I've made it 80%. But note what happens. So I've added a qualifier in the premise to increase, hopefully increase its level of certainty. But that same qualifier has to end up in the contention. So I have raised the level of certainty of this contention compared to this one, but the contention is no longer identical. So I might believe the president was born in Hawaii, with maybe a 40% probability of being true. But the contention the president was likely born in Hawaii, I might believe with 80%. But keep in mind, once you add qualifiers, they're no longer the same. So the actual truth of whether the president was born in Hawaii, the perception of the audience might not change. It's just that when you change the contention by adding a qualifier, you can increase many times how certain that contention is believed. So now we're moving on to multiple linkages. So a line of reasoning can consist of multiple linkages rather than just one linkage with two premises. So we've pretty much so far just been dealing with two premises. And in Rationale, they often have, two premises, and then the next support of reasoning comes in below, but we're not going to go into that, because here, with the logic bridge, we always add our premises horizontally as we make the bridge. So I'm just pointing out here in this example that any line of reasoning is not limited to just two premises. Here we have 3, 4, here we have 5 linked premises. Now remember, they're all transitively linked premises, so the back of one is the subject, is the beginning of the other, or the predicate of one becomes the subject of the next one, with the addition right here of the universal quantifier. And that same pattern back to front links all of these. And you also see that the subject of the contention, the president, is the subject of the first premise, and the predicate phrase of the contention right here is the predicate phrase of the last premise. And that each of these sentences have been put in, the categorical form. So this is an illustration that the number of premises can be more than 2. Here, of course, we have a couple assumptions that are supporting premise number 2. And with Rationale, it's very easy to just add more premises. It's not shown here, but you just click on the co-premise box and just drag them down into here, and then type in the wording so it's this front to back, and you're good. Now we're going to look at, not only does it go horizontally, but you can also have levels of that argument structure. Here we call it inferential net levels. So a line of reasoning can also depend on multiple levels of assumptions with their own lines of reasoning. So you can see how complex an argument can get, but we're always separating the linked premises from the level of assumptions to the next level of linked premises. So here our contention is that Barack is a natural-born citizen of the United States. And to support that, our line of reasoning, the logic bridge, is that premise 1, Barack was born in Hawaii according to witness Governor Abercrombie. Premise 2, back to front now, one who was born in Hawaii according to witness Governor Abercrombie was born in Hawaii. And premise 3, one who was born in Hawaii is a natural-born citizen of the United States. So that supports our contention that Barack is a natural-born citizen of the United States, because we have our reasoning in a transitive arrangement. So, we can make the assumption by transitivity that the Barack is a natural-born citizen of the United States. But premise 2, just hypothetically here, depends on 3 assumptions. Remember, this is a reliability of a source type of premise where you have a witness. So one of the assumptions is that the witness was in a position to know, and the witness was not biased in favor of Barack. And the third assumption is the witness was capable of perceiving the event correctly. Well, I could just do an argument and just stop right here at the level of the assumptions. But somebody in the audience might come along and say, yeah, but what supports this assumption? Well, then you go right back to, you treat this assumption just like it's the main contention, and you create its own logic bridge, which supports the assumption, where the subject of the first premise is the same as the subject of what is now the sub-contention here. The predicate phrase of the last premise is the predicate phrase of the conclusion here of this contention, and they're supported back to front, back to front. So, for example, the assumption the witness was in a position to know is supported by 3 premises. 3. Here you have the witness was in the hospital waiting room at the time of birth according to the nurse on duty. Well, one who was in the hospital waiting room at the time of the birth according to the nurse on duty was in the hospital waiting room at the time of birth. And one who was in the hospital waiting room at the time of birth was in a position to know. So here I put in the reasoning that supports that assumption. But somebody might say, okay, I understand this line of reasoning or this logic bridge, but isn't there an assumption about this premise right here? They might say, well, aren't you assuming that the nurse on duty remembered the incident correctly? And I'd say, well, yes, I am. And they'd say, well, how do you support this assumption? And then I would have to develop, as I've done here, another logic bridge. And as you can see, you get levels of linked premises with assumptions that can have more linked premises. So you can see how complex an argument becomes when you begin to reveal, the levels of reasoning that might be contained within them. Now, believe it or not, something as complex as this one here that was created with the Rationale software can even be created in just a simple word processing program. I'm just showing you this for your interest, because you don't need argument mapping programs to create argument maps. I mean, you can do them with pencil and paper, or you can do them in word processors. But and here's one that illustrates doing that same argument with a word processor. And here, what we use is, in this design, the linked premises are connected with the same vertical margin, and the assumptions are horizontally attached. So in a sense, I've turned the bridge on its side. But here you can see the 3 linked premises that we saw on the previous page. 1, 2, and here's the third. But this second linked premise is supported by these 3 assumptions right here. This one, and this one. And this assumption, though, has 2 premises. So it's a different visual language and you're using different software, but even if you don't have any kind of argument mapping program, you can use these visual conventions to create very complex arguments. Here I've just turned it on its side so you can kind of see how this word format in an outline form when turned on its side actually does resemble the lockage bridge with the piers and the spans. So now we're going to talk about the Toulmin model of argument. Remember, Toulmin came up with his model in 1958, and it's really gotten legs. I mean, it's taught in many argument and communication courses. And we're going to show how the Toulmin model translates into the logic bridge, and how the logic bridge is more effective, frankly, and more rigorous, has more flexibility than the Toulmin model. So this is part of the Toulmin model that's often shown, which is the claim. This is the famous Harry is a British subject. We've been calling that the contention. The datum, which is here Harry was born in Bermuda, and what Toulmin calls the warrant. Anyone born in Bermuda is a British subject. And what Toulmin then calls backing, which is support for that warrant, which is the British Nationality Act identifies anyone born in Bermuda as a British subject. So Toulmin, these are all actually linked premises, but Toulmin gives separate names to them: datum, warrant, and backing. And I'm going to show how those names are really unnecessary. They're confusing to learn, and they don't really assist, because these are all just linked premises, as you'll see in a moment. So let's start out with the contention, remember? And we're using the Rationale software applied with the logic bridge method. So the contention is Harry is a British subject. So the advocate says, my contention, claim or conclusion, is that Harry is a British subject. And the audience says, well, how did you reach that conclusion? They don't see the connection between Harry and is a British subject. So the advocate says, well, my line of reasoning consists of two premises. Premise 1, Harry was born in Bermuda. Premise 2, any who was born in Bermuda is a British subject. Therefore, by class inclusion and transitivity, therefore Harry is a British subject. So now you can see that in Toulmin terms, this first premise, he would call it the datum, and he would call the second the warrant. Here the audience says, well, how did you arrive at premise 2? What supports, what reasoning supports any who was born in Bermuda is a British subject? So here the advocate says, well, my new line of reasoning consists of three premises. Harry was born in Bermuda. One who was born in Bermuda meets the requirements of the British Nationality Act. One who meets the requirements of the British Nationality Act is a British subject. Therefore, Harry is a British subject. So you can see here now we have an argument. You could call this the data, this the warrant, and this the backing. But all they are really linked premises, front to back, in the logic bridge order. But the audience might not stop with, datum, warrant, and backing. They might want more support, which is where the flexibility of the logic bridge comes in. Here the audience says, okay, I agree to some extent with your premise 2 and 3, but what's the reasoning that supports 1? Harry was born in Bermuda. How'd you arrive at premise 1? So now I just fit in more linked premises. So my line of reasoning then consists of 4 premises. Harry has a Bermuda birth certificate. One who has a Bermuda birth certificate was born in Bermuda. Any who was born in Bermuda meets the requirements of the British Nationality Act. One who meets the requirements of the British Nationality Act is a British subject. Therefore, Harry is a British subject. So you can see that datum, warrant, and backing is not the limit of the number of premises that can be linked together. And you don't need to think in terms of data, warrant, backing. All you need to do is think in terms of linked premises, following the logic bridge for requirements. And the reasoning questioning, might continue. Toulmin doesn't talk about assumptions, but if they're different than the linked premises, and you have to consider them many times in an argument. Because here the audience might say, well, what assumptions are you making? If you're going to be rigorous and fully flesh out the argument. And here the advocate hypothetically says, well, I'm making 3 assumptions. So if I have premise 2 that was one who has a Bermuda birth certificate was born in Bermuda, well, that assumes that the birth certificate was not mistakenly issued. And my premise 2, any who was born in Bermuda meets the requirements of the British Nationality Act, well, that depends on an assumption that there's only one requirement needed to be met under the Act. And premise 4, one who meets the requirements of the British Nationality Act is a British subject, well, that depends on the assumption that the person has not announced their British citizenship. So you can see that you can let go of the Toulmin model because theoretically it was a huge advance, moving away from formal logic into informal logic, and has just impacted, the research and argumentation tremendously. But it is limited in application and difficult to explain, and doesn't fully encapsulate all the features of an argument, and really doesn't permit you to construct, doesn't give you enough structure, scaffolding to construct logical arguments, because there's no precision in describing what is a warrant and how does that relate to the wording of a premise and what is the wording of a backing. So the logic bridge provides that structure for you so that you always know you're creating a clear and logical argument. Well, you can also have multiple lines of reasoning that support a particular contention. Here, this example illustrates multiple or 2 lines of separate reasoning reaching the same contention. So multiple lines of reasoning may increase the subjective perception of the level and certainty of the contention. So here we have the same contention. The president was born in Hawaii, and we have 2 logic bridges, each providing separate support to that contention. The first one, premise 1, is the president was born in Kapiolani Maternity and Gynecological Hospital. Premise 2, one who was born in Kapiolani Maternity and Gynecological Hospital was born in Hawaii. And of course, by transitivity, class inclusion transitivity, I can infer the president was born in Hawaii. But I also can have a separate logic bridge. Here I have one. Premise 3, the president has a Hawaiian birth certificate. Premise 4, one who has a Hawaiian birth certificate was born in Hawaii. So I can infer then that the president was born in Hawaii. So you can, when you're creating your argument maps, you can have, more than one logic bridge supporting the same contention. Now, objections or rebuttals is something we're going to talk about in the second presentation, which is part 2. But, use this time before moving on to the second one to really get good at creating, the affirmative argument. Here's some of the reference list, or the endnotes, and you can see Engelbretson, and Summers. These are the theoretical researchers who came up with term functor logic, which is kind of the ground foundation for the logic bridge. And here's 2 Oxford Journal articles I wrote that discuss the logic bridge. In them you'll see discussions about how any classical formal logic patterns can be translated into the logic bridge, and how Wigmore's chart method can be translated in the logic bridge, and more of the academic details. And of course I want to acknowledge certainly Tim Van Gelder for his many years of support and encouragement in understanding conventional argument mapping, and Peter Tillers, who has been very encouraging. I've also found the work of Douglas Walton has really given me my core background in understanding the nature of argumentation. And of course I have to acknowledge the seminal work of Fred Summers and George Engelbretson in their new syllogistic, which the logic bridge is a part of. And finally I want to acknowledge Sharon Lee for our many years of ongoing discussions about the placement and utility of fact-based inquiry within the dimensional structures of knowledge. And I'm grateful for the observations and suggestions made by Vanessa McDonald, who's sitting right here with me, in developing this YouTube video. Thank you.
Thank you.